Hey guys, tonight we are pushing past the myths of glorious Viking feasts. The ones with cracking fires and tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats. Instead, we're going to take a journey into the quiet, often grim, reality of what it was actually like to eat in the Viking Age. And I'll be honest with you, based on the historical menu, you might not have the stomach for it. It was a world of survival, where flavor was a luxury and preservation was everything. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And for our little ritual, I'd love for you to drop a comment and tell me what city you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. It's always amazing to see where these stories travel. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The air is cold, sharper than you expected. It bites at your exposed skin as you stand before the longhouse. It's a low, imposing structure. A great spine of timber and turf hunkered down against the grey sky. It looks less like a building and more like a feature of the landscape, something that grew out of the earth itself. This, you've been told, is where the feasting happens. This is the Great Hall. From here, you can hear the muffled sounds of life within, a low hum of voices. But it doesn't sound like a roaring party. It sounds subdued. You reach for the heavy wooden door, its surface rough and splintery beneath your palm. It swings inward with a protesting groan, and you step across the threshold, out of the wind and into the gloom. The first thing that hits you isn't the warmth, but the smoke. It's everywhere. A thick, hazy fog hangs in the air, catching the light from a long, open fire pit that runs down the center of the hall. There's no chimney here, a classic feature of the Viking longhouse. All the smoke from the cooking and heating fire simply drifts upwards, looking for a small, lonely hole in the thatched roof to escape through. Your eyes immediately begin to water. A slight, stinging sensation that you'll have to get used to. The second thing you notice is the smell. It's a complex and deeply earthy aroma. There's the sharp, acrid scent of the wood smoke, of course, but beneath that, there's the damp, animal tang of wet wool from dozens of cloaks. The faint, musty smell of the turf and water walls, and an underlying, pervasive scent of something sour, like old fish in soured milk. It's the smell of people living very, very close together, through a long, damp winter. Your vision adjusts to the flickering, dancing firelight. The grand feast you imagined isn't here. There are no Vikings with horned helmets, those were much later. Operatic invention. There are just people, men and women in simple, dark-hued tunics, sitting on low, backless benches that flank the central fire. Their faces, illuminated by the low flames, are weathered and serious. Yori waved over to a spot on one of the benches, and you sit down on the hard, unforgiving wood. It's here you learn a quiet, crucial lesson about this society, where use it matters. This is a little detail that Archaeologian sagas hint at. The chieftain and his most important warriors on family occupy the high seat, a slightly raised platform in the very middle of the hall. Where the light is best and the warmth from the fire is most direct. The further away from that center you are, the lower your status. You, my friend, are sitting pretty far down the bench, closer to the door, where the drafts are colder and the smoke is thicker. Before you is not a platter of food, but a simple wooden bowl and a roughly carved spoon. Someone moves down the line, swashing a ladle of something into each bowl. You look down. It's a thick, greyish-brown stew. You can see grains of barley floating in it, maybe some chopped-up root vegetables. A piece of dark, dense bread is placed beside it. This is the feast. This is the reality. This image of the longhouse as a dedicated feast hall is itself something historians are still gently debating. While grand events certainly happened here, for most, this space was an all-in-one hub. It was the living room, the dining room, the workshop for repairing tools or weaving cloth, and at night, The benches you're sitting on would likely become beds. It wasn't a special occasion venue, it was the very heart of the farmstead. A machine for living. And the food reflected that pragmatic, unglamorous truth. You take a tentative spoonful of the stew. It's bland, slightly salty, and gritty. The warmth is welcome, but the flavor is absent. This single, underwhelming taste is your real introduction to the Viking world. And the reason for this bland, smoky reality isn't a lack of imagination. It's hanging in the cold air right outside this door. It's the iron grip of the Scandinavian seasons. You push the grey mush around your bowl with your spoon, the warmth from the fire feeling good on one side of your face while the other feels the persistent chill of the cavernous hole. The taste in your mouth is one of absence more than presence. A bit of salt, the faint earthiness of barley, but mostly nothing. And you have to wonder, why, for a people so famously bold and adventurous, is the food so profoundly boring? To understand the contents of your bowl, you have to understand the world outside the longhouse door. It's not just a place, it's a clock. A ruthless, unforgiving clock with only two important settings: a short, frantic burst of green, and a long, deep, suffocating white. Right now, as you sit in the smoky twilight of the hall, the world is sliding into that long white. The days are getting noticeably shorter. Soon, the sun will become a weak rumor on the southern horizon, a pale disk that skims the tops of the mountains for a few hours before surrendering to the gloom again. The wind howling outside carries the first true bite of deep winter. The ground, once soft enough for farming, will soon be frozen solid as rock. The nearby fjord, your highway to the rest of the world, might soon be choked with ice, cutting you off completely. This is the reality that dictates everything. But it wasn't always like this. Just a few months ago, this land was in the grip of the other season, the frantic green. The sun barely set, circling the sky in a long, lazy arc that bathed the landscape in 20 hours of daylight. This wasn't a time for lazy summer picnics. It was a time of desperate, relentless work. Every single person on this farmstead, from the oldest to the youngest child who could walk, was caught in a race against that invisible clock. You would have been out in the fields, bent over, cutting barley and oats with a small iron sickle. You would have been tending the small, precious vegetable garden, a patch of hardy cabbages and onions. You'd be driving the cows, sheep, and goats to high summer pastures to fatten up. You'd be out in the woods, gathering berries, nuts, and mushrooms, and on the shoreline, collecting seaweed. It was a sprint. Every single calorie that could be grown, hunted, or gathered had to be brought in, because the brief window of abundance was about to slam shut. The food you ate in the summer was better. Yes, a bit of fresh fish, perhaps some greens, maybe even a splash of fresh milk. But even then, the priority was not to feast, but to preserve. That fish you caught, most of it was immediately gutted and set to be salted or smoked. The milk, a large portion, was turned into something that would last. Every harvest was tried a tiny amount for immediate consumption. The vast majority for the long, dark months ahead. And now, those months are here. The world outside has shrunk. Life has retreated indoors. The vibrant green is a distant memory, and the food in your bowl is the ghost of that summer's frantic labor. That barley was harvested months ago, dried and stored in a clay-lined pit. The root vegetable, if there is one, was one of the last things pulled from the earth before the first deep frost. The taste of your stew isn't the taste of a fresh meal. It's the taste of careful rationing. It's the flavor of survival. This seasonal shift was so fundamental that it was even codified in their laws. Historians have found references in Old Norse legal texts to a specific date, usually around mid-October. That marks the official beginning of winter. After this date, for instance, you were no longer allowed to let your livestock graze freely in the common outlands. They had to be brought in unfed with the fodder you spent all summer collecting. Winter wasn't just a weather pattern, it was a legal and social state of being. Now you might have heard that the Viking Age took place during something called the medieval warm period. And that's technically true, but warm is a very relative term up here in Scandinavia. While the climate was slightly milder than the brutal little ice age that came later, a detail that climatologists and historians are still trying to map with precision, it didn't turn Norway into the French Riviera. It might have made growing barley a little more reliable, maybe pushed the tree line a bit further up the mountains. But it did not, by any stretch of the imagination, cancel winter. The fundamental challenge remained the same: a short growing season followed by a long, dark, and frozen winter where almost nothing could be grown. That slight climatic advantage was the razor-thin margin on which this entire society was built. So as you sit here, you realize the truth. This culture isn't defined by the feasts. It's defined by the hunger that the feasts were meant to keep at bay. Every meal is a quiet victory against the cold. And your main weapon in this fight wasn't a sword or an axe. It was a cooking pot, and the near magical ability to turn the fleeting bounty of summer into something that could see you through the dark. And that process starts with the most basic, most important, and most monotonous food of all: a simple pot of porridge. The next morning, you're woken not by the sun, but by the general stirring of the longhouse. People are rolling off their benches, folding their furs, and the central fire is being coaxed back to life from glowing embers. The air is thick with the same smoky, lived-in smells last night. There's a quiet, purposeful energy in the air. Survival doesn't allow for sleeping in. Your stomach crumbles, a hollow feeling that reminds you of last night's meager meal. You follow the others to the fire pit, where a large, soot-blackened cauldron hangs from a chain. It's already simmering, and the smell rising from it is deeply, profoundly familiar. It's the same smell as last night's dinner. This is your breakfast, and in all likelihood, it will also be your lunch and your dinner. Welcome to the backbone of the Viking diet, the true fuel of the Viking Age: porridge. Or, to be more accurate, a kind of all-purpose grain slurry that defies easy categorization. They called it grautia. You hold out your wooden bowl, and it's filled with the same thick, greyish-brown substance. Looking closer in the morning light, you can see it for what it is. It's primarily barley, maybe with some oats or rye mixed in, boiled in water until the grains have broken down into a soupy, substantial mush. There are no berries, no honey, no sprinkle of cinnamon, just the pure, unadulterated taste of boiled grain. You take a spoonful. The texture is coarse. The husks of the barley haven't been fully milled away, so it has a gritty, chewy quality that forces you to work your jaw. The flavor is, well, it's the flavor of sustenance. It's warm, it's filling, and it has the faint, almost nutty taste of the barley itself, but it is overwhelmingly, soul-crushingly bland. This pot of grautia was the engine of daily life. It was easy, it was efficient, and it stretched the precious grain stores as far as they could possibly go. Why go to the trouble of baking bread every day when you could just boil the grains? The cauldron would often be kept simmering over the fire all day long. People would dip their bowls in whenever they were hungry. Sometimes, leftovers from the previous night's meal: a few bits of fish, some chopped up cabbage, a spoonful of vegetable broth would be scraped into the pot. This created a perpetually evolving stew, a living culinary history of the past few days. Archaeologists digging in old Viking settlements often find these huge cauldrons. Physical proof of this one-pot feeds-all approach. This wasn't just peasant food, either. While a chieftain might get a richer version, perhaps with some dried meat or a dollop of soured cream mixed in, everyone from the highest warrior to the lowest farmhand was powered by this stuff. It was the Viking equivalent of gas in the tank. It was what gave you the energy to mend a sail, to chop wood, to row a long ship for hours on end. It wasn't exciting, but it worked. Now for a slightly less appetizing detail. The grain itself wasn't always clean. The process of harvesting with a sickle and threshing by hand meant that all sorts of things could end up in the grain sack. Dust, grit, tiny pebbles, fragments of insects, and even the seeds of hardy weeds like corn cockle, which is mildly poisonous and has a bitter, unpleasant taste. These would all get ground up along with the grain, so your daily groutier might come with an extra crunch you didn't ask for, or a lingering bitter aftertaste. Historians analyzing the contents of preserved Viking latrines a glamorous job. I know confirm this, finding all sorts of non-grain plant matter and grit mixed in with the digested food. You might think, couldn't they just make it taste better? Couldn't they add some herbs maybe? A few hardy herbs like dill or coriander might be available, dried from the summer, but they were used sparingly. The real issue was the lack of strong, contrasting flavors. There was no sugar, no pepper, no lemon. The palette of flavors was incredibly narrow. Your main options for seasoning were salt, if you could afford it, or maybe a splash of soured milk for a bit of tang. The very nature of this porridge is still a matter of some academic curiosity. Was it always a watery gruel, or was it sometimes cooked down into a much thicker, almost solid block? There are theories, based on some Solga descriptions and experimental archaeology, that the groutier could be cooked until it was so dense you could slice it. These cooled slices could then be fried in a bit of fat for a later meal, giving it a crispy exterior. This would have made it more portable for a shepherd or a hunter. So the stuff in your bowl might not always be a soup sometimes. It might be a solid, slice-able brick of boiled grain. As you finish your bowl, you feel full, not satisfied in a culinary sense, but your body recognizes that it has received fuel. You look around the longhouse. Everyone has eaten the same meal. Now, the day's work begins. There are tools to sharpen, leather to mend, wood to be chopped. No one is complaining about the food. It is what it is. It's the taste of another day of life, earned from the harvest of a long-gone summer. But as the day wears on, you might get lucky. Someone might offer you a piece of something else to go with your next bowl of porridge, a thick slice of Viking bread. And you're about to learn that bread is a very generous term for it. Later in the day, the gnawing emptiness in your stomach returns. The morning's porridge has done its job, but your body is asking for more. You see someone by the fire, using a long-handled tool to pull something from the hot embers at the edge of the pit. They are flat, dark, circular objects. Bread, or at least, that's what they call it. One is offered to you. You take it, and the first thing you notice is the weight. It feels surprisingly heavy in your hand, dense and solid, like a clay discus. It's raw, which is nice, but it doesn't have the light, airy feel you associate with bread. There's no yielding softness. You tap it with your knuckle. It makes a dull, solid thud. The color is a deep, murky brown, a result of the whole grains used, mostly barley or rye, as wheat was a fussy crop that grew purely in the northern climate. You can see bits of husk and whole grains embedded in the surface. It looks less like a loaf and more like a construction material. This is the Viking flatbread, a staple that was often baked directly on a hot stone or even in the ashes of the fire, which explains the slightly charred, dusty exterior. You break off a piece. It doesn't tear easily. It requires a bit of force, snapping with a dry, crumbly sound. You bring it to your mouth and take a bite. Your teeth meet serious resistance. The bread is tough, incredibly chewy, and has the same coarse, gritty texture as the porridge. It's a workout for your jaw. As you chew, you can feel the sandy grit between your teeth, a souvenir from the stone quern used to grind the flour. These querns were simple hand mills, two circular stones, one on top of the other. The grain was poured into a hole in the top stone, and then you'd grind it back and forth, crushing the grain into a coarse flour. It was slow, laborious work, and inevitably, tiny fragments of the stone would chip off and mix with the flour. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a major health issue. Archaeologists studying Viking skeletons consistently find evidence of extreme tooth wear. Their teeth are often worn down flat, sometimes right to the pulp, a direct result of a lifetime of chewing this gritty, abrasive bread and porridge. So as you chew, you are, in a very real sense, sanding down your own teeth. The flavor of the bread is much like its texture, dense and earthy. It's not leavened with yeast as we know it. True yeast cultivation was not a common practice. If the bread had any lift at all, it would come from either using a bit of sawdust or a piece of dough saved from a previous batch, or from the natural wild yeasts in the air, which would result in a slightly sour, tangy flavor, more often than not. Though, it was completely unleavened, just flour and water mixed into a stiff dough. A bizarre but practical little tidbit about Viking bread involves something called a traveling loaf. Some sources suggest that for long journeys, they would bake a large, ring-shaped loaf of this incredibly dense rye bread. They'd thread a rope through the hole and hang it from the rafters of the house to dry out completely. Over months, it would become rock hard, virtually immune to mold. It was less a food and more a preserved brick of calories. When you needed it, you'd have to break off a chunk with a hammer or the back of an axe and then soak it in water, ale, or stew to make it remotely edible. Survival food in its most literal and least appetizing form. You keep chewing. The bread isn't something you eat quickly. It demands time and effort. It's designed to be filling, to give you a solid, lasting energy source. You can see why it would be paired with the soupy grautrr. You'd use the hard bread as a spoon, a tool to scoop up the porridge, with the bread slowly softening as it soaked up the liquid. It was a perfect, if unglamorous, partnership. But what kind of flour was this? Exactly what we think of barley and rye. Historians are still debating how widespread certain grains were and if other, more desperate ingredients were used. In times of scarcity, it's highly likely that the precious grain flour would be extended with other things. This could include pea flour, bean flour, or even more unpalatable fillers like ground up tree bark or dried, powdered moss. The exact recipe for any given loaf would depend entirely on what was available, what time of year it was, and how desperate you were. The loaf in your hand is probably a good one, made mostly of grain. In a few months, it might be a very different story. You finally swallow the mouthful of bread. It's in your stomach like a warm stone. It's not delicious. It's not pleasant. But it's fuel. It feels solid, dependable. You look down at the remaining piece in your hand. This dense, gritty this, you realize, is the other half of the Viking fuel source. If porridge was the soupy, simmering heart of the diet, this hard bread was its tough, reliable skeleton, and to wash it all down, you're going to need a drink, but you won't be reaching for a glass of fresh, cold milk. That's a luxury you can't afford. Instead, you'll be getting acquainted with its much more common, and much more sour cousins. You've managed to get down the gritty bread, and now you're thirsty. Your throat feels dry and dusty from the smoky air and the dense food. You look around, hoping for a bucket of fresh water, but what you see instead is someone carrying a wooden pail filled with a thick, whitish liquid. They ladle some into a small wooden cup and hand it to you. You look into the cup. It's not milk, not the kind of fresh, flowing milk you might imagine coming straight from a cow. This is something else. It's thick, almost like a thin yogurt. And it has a distinctly sour smell, a sharp tang that puckers your nose. This is your introduction to the reality of dairy in the Viking Age. You take a tentative sip. The flavor is intensely sour, acidic, and tongue-tingling. It's followed by a rich, creamy-ish aftertaste. But the initial sourness is the dominant note. It's not a gentle, cultured flavor, it's a full-on, assertive tang. This is sky or something very much like it, a cornerstone of the Scandinavian diet for over 1,000 years. Why this sour stuff instead of fresh milk? The answer, like everything else, lies in practicality and preservation. Think about the farmstead. You might have a couple of cows, a few goats, maybe some sheep. They don't produce a huge volume of milk by modern standards. And more importantly, you have no refrigeration. Fresh milk, on a mild day, would begin to turn in a matter of hours. In a society obsessed with making every calorie last, drinking fresh milk was an almost wasteful act of fleeting luxury, reserved for the very young, the sick, or perhaps as a special treat right after milking. The vast majority of milk was immediately processed into something that would last. The primary method was to let it thaw naturally. The wild bacteria and yeasts in the air would go to work, fermenting the lactose milk sugar into lactic acid. This acid is a natural preservative. It prevents harmful bacteria from growing, allowing the milk to be kept for days or even weeks without spoiling. This soured milk was a daily drink, a staple beverage that provided hydration, protein, and probiotics. What you're drinking is the most basic form of this, but the Vikings were masters of dairy chemistry. They would take this process further. After the milk had soured and curdled, they would strain it through a cloth. This separated the liquid whey from the solid curds. The whey, a watery, acidic liquid, wasn't thrown away. Absolutely not. It was a valuable byproduct. It could be drunk on its own, used as a cooking liquid for the daily porridge, adding a bit of sour flavor and nutrients, or used as a pickling brine for other foods. Waste was not an option. The solid curds that were left behind were the real prize. This was I thick, concentrated, high-protein food that was, in essence, a form of fresh cheese. It could be eaten as is, like you're having it now, or mixed with a precious spoonful of honey, or some summer berries if you were very lucky. It was a vital source of protein, especially during the winter when other sources were scarce. An interesting little detail is how they managed this process consistently. Before the age of sterilized equipment and lab-grown cultures, how did they make sure the milk soured in the right way? One theory is that they practiced a form of backslopping. This means they would save a small amount of a good batch of soured milk or sky and mix it into the fresh milk, inoculating it with the right kind of beneficial bacteria. They also likely never washed the wooden pails and churns too thoroughly, allowing the porous wood to harbor the microbial culture that gave their dairy products a consistent house flavor. Each farmstead would have had its own unique blend of microbes, its own signature tang. But was all soured milk created equal? Not at all. Historians and food scientists debate the exact nature of these ancient dairy products. The term skyer and the soggers might not refer to the exact same product you can buy in a supermarket today. It was likely a catch-all term for a range of soured and strained milk products, with varying textures and intensities of flavor depending on the animal. The milk came from cow, goat, or sheep, the season, and the specific fermentation culture of the farm. Sheep's milk, for instance, has a much higher fat content, which would produce a richer, creamier, and perhaps even stronger tasting product than cow's milk. The process of separation also led to another crucial product, butter. They would churn the cream until it separated into butter and buttermilk. The buttermilk, like the whey, was a valuable sour beverage. The butter itself was a prized source of fat, a high-energy food essential for surviving the cold. You'd smear it on your gritty bread or add a lump to your porridge for a boost of calories. But even butter, a pure fat, could spoil. So how did they preserve a huge batch of butter made during the summer to last all winter? The answer lies not in a cellar, but in a much stranger, much damper place. You've accustomed your palate to the tang of soured milk, a flavor that now seems almost normal. You understand that this sourness is the taste of preservation, the clever trick that turns fleeting freshness into lasting sustenance. Now, someone offers you a small sliver of butter for your bread. It's pale and has a slightly waxy texture. You taste it. It's rich, fatty, and intensely flavorful. But there's a strange aftertaste you can't quite place. It's a deep, earthy, almost funky flavor, like a very strong cheese combined with the smell of damped soil. This isn't just butter. This is bog butter. To understand this strange flavor, You have to imagine it's the peak of summer. The cows and goats are grazing on lush pasture, and their milk is rich with fat. You've spent days churning, producing a massive surplus of golden butter. It's far more than you can eat before it goes rancid. You have no refrigerator, no salt to spare for something so fatty. So how do you store it for the lean winter months? You bury it. Specifically, you bury it in a peat bog. This practice sounds bizarre to us, but it was a form of ancient food technology that was surprisingly effective. All across northern Europe, from Scotland and Ireland to Scandinavia, archaeologists have unearthed caches of what we now call bog butter. These are large, solid lumps of a fatty substance, often wrapped in animal hide or tree bark, or packed into wooden containers, and then deliberately sunk into the cool, dark depths of a peat bog. Some of these discoveries are enormous, weighing over 50 pounds. Why a bog? A peat bog is a truly unique environment. It's highly acidic, very low in oxygen, and kept at a consistently cold temperature. These three factors create a natural refrigerator that is incredibly hostile to the bacteria that cause spoilage. When you submerge a large lump of butter in this environment, it's effectively sealed off from the world. It won't go rancid in the way we're used to. Instead, something else happens. A very slow, very strange chemical transformation takes place. Over months or even years in the bog, the butter undergoes a process called a deposyre formation. The fatty acids in the butter slowly change, altering its chemical structure. The texture changes from soft and creamy to something more solid, waxy, or crumbly, a bit like a hard cheese. And the flavor. Oh, the flavor. This is where things get really interesting. And frankly, a bit funky. As the butter ages in the bog, it absorbs compounds from the peat. It loses its familiar sweet, creamy flavor and develops a much stronger, more pungent one. People who have bravely tasted ancient bog butter or modern recreations describe the flavor in many ways: gummy, mossy, tangy, cheesy, and deeply earthy. The pleasant taste of fresh butter is gone, replaced by a powerful, acquired taste that speaks of the dark, damp place it restored. A curious little detail is that these stashes were often carefully marked, perhaps with a stake or a pile of stones on the bog surface, so the family could retrieve their precious winter fat stores. However, bogs are shifting, growing landscapes. It's likely that many families lost their butter. The mark is sinking or becoming overgrown, leaving the cache to be discovered by a surprised archaeologist 1,000 years later. So was this done purely for preservation? Or was this funky flavor actually desirable? This is a major point of debate among historians and archaeologists. The traditional view is that this was simply the most effective long-term storage method available, a primitive refrigerator. The strange flavor was just an unavoidable, and probably undesirable, side effect that you had to put up with to get the calories. However, a more recent school of thought suggests that maybe, just maybe, they liked it. Perhaps bog butter was not just preserved butter, but a deliberately created artisanal product, a sort of Viking Age funky cheese, in a diet that was overwhelmingly bland and monotonous. A powerful, pungent flavor like that of bog butter might have been a welcome, exciting addition. A small smear on a piece of hard bread could transform a boring meal. We may never know for sure if they were holding their noses while eating it or savoring it as a delicacy. You take another bite of your bread, the strange, earthy tang of the bog butter lingering on your tongue. It's a complex, challenging flavor. It's the taste of deep earth, of slow chemistry, of a long-dead summer's wealth brought back to life. It's a testament to the ingenuity of a people who would use the very landscape as their pantry. But this funky, earthy flavor is just one of the dominant notes in the Viking palate. Soon, you'll be introduced to the two flavors that truly define the taste of preserved food here: salt and its smoky, acrid twin. The day wears on, and the time for the main evening meal approaches. The familiar pot of grautia is still simmering, but tonight, there's something extra. A man with a large knife is slicing pieces from a huge, Dark slab of meat resting on a wooden plank. It doesn't look like a fresh roast. The color is a deep, reddish brown, almost black at the edges, and the texture looks dense and firm. He hands you a few thin strips along with your portion of porridge. You pick up a strip of the meat. It's stiff and unyielding. You bring it to your nose, and the smell is overwhelmingly arrestingly salty. It's a dry, clean, saline scent that almost makes your eyes water. This is your formal introduction to one of the two pillars of Viking Age preservation: salt. You put a piece in your mouth. The saltness is immediate and intense. It floods your taste buds, a sharp, burning sensation that dominates everything else. It's not the subtle, flavor-enhancing saltness of a modern dish. It's a harsh, brutal salinity that speaks of its true purpose, not flavor, but war against decay. Beneath the salt, you can taste the meat itself. It's beef, or maybe mutton, but the texture is incredibly tough. The salt has drawn out most of the moisture, leaving the muscle fibers dense and chewy. It's a long, laborious chew, a battle between your teeth and the leathery meat. As you work on it, your mouth cries out for water, for something to quench the fire of the salt. This was the fate of most meat in the Viking world. When a cow, pig, or sheep was slaughtered in the autumn, the designated culling time to reduce the number of mouths to feed over winter, a small portion might be eaten fresh in a celebratory feast. But the vast majority of the carcass was immediately butchered and prepared for long-term storage, and salting was a primary method. The process was simple and effective. The meat would be rubbed with coarse salt, packed in barrels or troughs between layers of salt, or submerged in a powerful brine solution. The salt worked by osmosis, putting water out of the meat cells and, just as importantly, out of any bacteria or fungi present, killing them or rendering them dormant. This allowed meat to be kept for the entire winter and well into the spring, a vital source of protein when no fresh food was available. But where did all this salt come from for a society surrounded by the sea? You'd think it would be plentiful. This brings up a fascinating but often overlooked logistical challenge. In the hot climates of the Mediterranean, you can produce salt easily by evaporating seawater in large, shallow pans under the sun. In the cool, cloudy climate of Scandinavia, this method is highly inefficient. You can't rely on the sun. Instead, the Vikings had to use a more labor-intensive method. They would boil seawater. This meant hauling huge quantities of water away from the shore and then using vast amounts of precious firewood to boil it down until only the salt crystals remained. It was a tedious, fuel-hungry process. Another method, practiced in certain coastal areas, involved gathering salt-impregnated sand or turf during high tides, then running fresh water through it to create a concentrated brine, which was then boiled. Because of this difficulty, salt was a valuable commodity. It wasn't something you'd sprinkle casually. It was a strategic resource, the foundation of your winter survival. This reliance on heavily salted food likely had health consequences, while it's hard to prove from the skeletal record. A diet this high in sodium would have put a significant strain on the body, potentially contributing to issues we associate with high salt intake today. It's a little historical irony that the very thing that kept them alive might have also been slowly harming them. Now, was all salted meat just these tough, salty strips? Not necessarily. This is another area where historians imagine a bit of culinary nuance might have existed. While the base product was brutally salty, it wouldn't always be eaten raw like this. A common preparation would be to soak the salted meat in fresh water for hours, or even a full day, to draw out some of the excess salt before adding it to the simmering cauldron of grouty or tea. This would soften the meat and disperse the saltness into the stew, flavoring the whole pot. The debate, however, is how much fresh water you could spare for this kind of task. Especially in the deep of winter, when rivers and lakes were frozen over, melting snow and ice for cooking and drinking was hard work. Using it today, salt meat might have been a luxury. You finally manage to swallow the piece of meat. The salty residue coats your entire mouth. You take a big gulp of the sour milk beverage to wash it down. the tanginess cutting through the salt in a way that is surprisingly effective. You look at the remaining strips. This is protein. This is what keeps your muscles from wasting away during the long, dark months. The taste is harsh. The texture is punishing. But it is life. But salt was only one half of the preservation equation. Its partner was just as powerful, just as pervasive. And it hung in the very air you've been breathing since you walked into this longhouse. You are still dealing with the lingering, aggressive saltness on your tongue when you notice a different flavor weaving its way into your senses. It's been there all along. In the back of your throat, in your nose, clinging to your clothes. It's the smell of the whole itself smoke. But now, as you eat the evening meal, you realize it's not just in the air. It's in the food. Someone passes you a piece of fish. It's a thick fillet of cod or herring. Its skin a beautiful, burnished bronze color. It flakes apart easily, far more tender than the salted meat. You put a piece in your mouth. The flavor is intense, but in a completely different way. It's not just salty, though there's certainly salt involved. The dominant taste is a powerful, pungent, and slightly bitter flavor that coats your entire palate. It's the taste of pure, concentrated wood smoke. This is the second pillar of Viking preservation. Just like salting, smoking was a way to dehydrate food and imbue it with antimicrobial compounds that prevent spoilage. The process was deeply intertwined with the architecture of your home. Remember the lack of a chimney in the longhouse that wasn't just a design flaw, it was a feature. High up in the rafters of the longhouse, hanging from wooden hooks, you would see a ghostly array of food, whole fish, long strips of meat, sausages, even cheeses, all suspended in the smoky gloom. The constant, low-burning fire in the central pit wasn't just for heat and light. It was a slow cooker and a smokehouse for the entire building. Day after day, week after week, the rising smoke would slowly drift past these hanging provisions, curing them, drying them, and infusing them with its acrid, preservative essence. This method was particularly crucial for fish. The Viking world was a maritime world. The seasoned rivers teemed with live herring, cod, salmon, and trout were foundational to the diet. During the great spawning runs, you could catch fish in enormous quantities, far too many to eat fresh. Smoking was the perfect way to transform this fleeting bounty into a stable, year-round resource. The taste of the smoked fish in your mouth is complex. It's oily, rich, and flaky, but the smoke flavor is relentless. It has a slight bitterness, a chemical tang from the phenols and other compounds in the wood smoke. It tastes a bit like licking a campfire. For our people living in a world of bland porridge and brutally salty meat, this powerful, aromatic flavor might have been a welcome change. It was a strong, assertive taste in a culinary landscape that often lacked them. A little-known fact about this process is that the type of wood burned would have a dramatic impact on the flavor of the food. Just like modern barbecue enthusiasts obsess over using hickory, applewood, or mesquite, the Vikings would have known that different woods produce different kinds of smoke. Burning alder wood, which is common in Scandinavia, produces a light, slightly sweet smoke that is ideal for fish. Oak would give a much stronger, more robust flavor suitable for red meat. Birch, another common tree, would also have its own unique profile. They wouldn't have articulated it in the language of a modern chef, but through generations of trial and error, they would have developed a deep, practical knowledge of flavor woods. Their choice of firewood was also a culinary choice. You can see the practicality of this system. Your house is also your pantry. The fire that keeps you from freezing to death is the same fire that preserves your food. It's a perfect, closed loop of survival. However, it also meant that everything in your life was permeated with the smell and taste of smoke. Your clothes, your hair, your skin, you would carry that scent with you constantly. And the food, even the bread baked near the fire or the porridge cooked over it, would absorb that flavor. Smoke wasn't a seasoning you added, it was the default setting for your entire world. But was this method universally used and understood in the same way? The specifics of smoking techniques are still a topic of quiet scholarly discussion. Was it always a hot smoking process from the main fire, which cooked the food as it cured it, or did they also practice cold smoking, building a separate, smoldering fire and piping the cool smoke into a small hut or enclosure where fish was hung? Cold smoking allows for a much longer preservation time and a different texture, and it's a practice that is central to modern Scandinavian cuisine. Evidence for dedicated smoking structures is sparse, but not non-existent, suggesting that different methods were likely employed depending on the scale of the operation and the desired result. You swallow the piece of fish. The smoky flavor lingers, an oily, pungent ghost that joins the salty residue of the meat. Your palate is now a battleground of the primary tastes of preservation, salt and smoke. These were the flavors that meant survival. They were the tastes of foresight, of summer's hard work paying off in the dead of winter. But there was another method of preservation, one that relied on a process that was gentler than salt and slower than smoke. It relied on simply letting things dry out in the cold, clean air, creating a food that was perhaps the toughest of them all. After the assertive flavors of salt and smoke, you're presented with another form of preserved food, one that seems deceptively simple. It's a piece of fish, but it has been bronzed by smoke. It's pale, almost translucent, and hard as a rock. You're also given a thin, dark strip of what you're told is meat. It looks like a piece of old leather, and it feels just as tough. This is stockfish, and its meaty cousin, dried meat. You pick up the piece of fish first. It's incredibly light for its size, and it makes a sharp, clacking sound when you tap it against the wooden table. There's no give to it whatsoever. This is cod that has been preserved using one of the oldest, simplest, and most effective methods known to humanity: freeze drying in the open air. The process is pure, temperamental genius. In the late winter and early spring, when the cod are plentiful but the temperatures are still hovering around freezing, the fish are caught, gutted, and hung up to dry on huge wooden racks called H-gel. The cold, dry winds of the northern winter whip through the racks. The water in the fish freezes, and then, through a process called sublimation, the ice turns directly into vapor without ever becoming liquid. Over a period of about 3 months, the fish slowly loses up to 80% of its water content, leaving behind a perfectly preserved, nutrient-rich board of protein. You try to take a bite. It's impossible. It's like trying to bite into a piece of wood that would break your teeth. You're handed a small mallet. This, you learn, is the first step in eating stockfish. You have to beat it. You place the fish on a hard surface and give it a few solid whacks. It begins to shred and break apart into fibrous, whitish threads. The process is noisy and feels more like demolition than food prep. Once it's sufficiently shredded, you pop a few fibers into your mouth. The texture is incredibly chewy, like a mouthful of tough, stringy wool. The flavor is subtle, a concentrated, pure taste of cod, with a faint, clean hint of the sea. It's not salty or smoky, it's just intensely fishy. It's a flavor that grows as you chew, and chew, and chew. It takes a very long time to break down. This stuff was the ultimate survival food. It was lightweight, making it perfect for travel. It was packed with protein, and most importantly, it was virtually indestructible. A properly dried stockfish could last for years without spoiling. It was a primary export and a source of wealth for many Viking communities, especially in places like northern Norway where the drying conditions were perfect. It was traded across Europe, a reliable source of protein for inland communities and armies on the move. Now you turn your attention to the strip of dark meat. This has undergone a similar, though less dramatic, process. Strips of beef, mutton, or even whale meat would be lightly salted and then hung to dry in a cool, airy shed or loft. The wind would slowly wick the moisture away, creating a hard, durable jerky. You try to tear a piece off with your teeth. It's a serious struggle. The meat is tough, sinewy, and resilient. It feels like you're trying to rip a piece of shoe leather. You finally manage to tear off a small piece and begin to chew. It's a marathon. Your jaw muscles ache with the effort. The flavor is a strong, gummy taste of cured meat, with a salty undertone. It's incredibly dense, and a small piece takes a very long time to eat. This brings us to a rather strange little tidbit about Viking eating habits. Mentioned in some of the sagas, there are references to people eating skarpjtt, a type of wind-dried mutton that is a direct descendant of this Viking practice and is still made today in the Faroe Islands. The most peculiar part of the tradition is that the meat is aged for so long that a specific type of mold, a noble rot, is allowed to grow on the surface, which is said to add to the complexity of the flavor, much like in a blue cheese. So, the dried meat you're eating might not just be dried, it might be deliberately, carefully aged to the point of being moldy. The very existence of stockfish challenges a common misconception. We often think of Viking as a single, monolithic culture, but the truth is, the Viking world was vast and varied. The stockfish Vikings of the far north had a diet and an economy that was very different from the dairying Vikings of a more sheltered fjord in the south. The method of preservation used salting, smoking, or drying depended entirely on your local climate and resources. This is a point that culinary historians are always trying to refine, mapping the regional differences in the Viking diet. Was air drying a universal practice, or was it a specialized technique confined to the areas with the perfect weather? For the current consensus leans toward the latter, making stockfish a regional specialty, but a massively important one. To make these dried foods more palatable, you wouldn't usually eat them straight like this. Like the heavily salted meat, both the stockfish and the dried meat would typically be rehydrated. The stockfish would be soaked in water for days, sometimes with a bit of ash added to the water to create a lye solution, a process that eventually evolved into the infamous Scandinavian dish lutefisk. This would soften the fish into a gelatinous texture. The dried meat would be simmered for hours in the daily porridge pot, slowly releasing its flavor and becoming tender. But right now, you're just chewing. And chewing, it's a direct, physical connection to the food. It's a reminder that eating wasn't always a passive, pleasant experience. It was often work. And as you finally swallow that tough, fibrous mouthful, you realize you've only experienced the more mainstream preserved foods. The Vikings had another method of preservation, one that took place in a barrel and relied on time, bacteria, and a very strong stomach. You survived salt, smoke, and the sheer toughness of wind-dried protein. Your palate has been well and truly broken in. You might be feeling a little bit proud of your culinary fortitude, but the day is not over, and the Vikings have one more category of preserved food to test your limits. This one doesn't involve heat or wind. It involves a dark barrel, a lot of salt, and time. It involves fermentation. Someone approaches you, not with a platter, but with a small wooden lid, which they use to offer you a tiny, glistening morsel of fish. Even from a distance, you can smell it. It's a smell unlike anything you've encountered so far. It's not smoky, not just salty, and not gamay. It's a sharp, pungent, chemical smell, a bit like industrial-strength cleaning fluid. It's the smell of ammonia. You look down at the piece of fish. It's pale and has a soft, almost gelatinous texture. This is a precursor to modern Scandinavian fermented fish dishes, like the notorious Swedish surströmming or the Icelandic hakal. It is fish that has been allowed to decompose in a controlled environment. You hesitate. The smell is a primal warning sign. Everything in your brain is screaming at you that this has gone bad, that it's rotten and dangerous. But you look around. Other people are eating it, albeit in very small quantities, with a stoic lack of expression. This is food. This is survival. You take a deep breath, hold it, and pop the morsel into your mouth. The texture is soft and pasty, dissolving on your tongue, but the flavor, it's an explosion. An overwhelming, eye-watering wave of pungent, salty, and profoundly ammoniated taste. It burns. It's not the burn of chili peppers, but a chemical burn that stings the inside of your mouth and the back of your throat. It feels less like eating and more like a science experiment gone wrong. This is the power of enzymatic fermentation. The process varied, but a common method for fatty fish like herring was to pack them in barrels with just enough salt to inhibit the growth of deadly bacteria like botulism, but not enough to stop the fish's own natural enzymes from going to work. These enzymes begin to break down the proteins and fats in the fish, essentially digesting it from the inside out. This process, called autolysis, is what produces the incredibly strong smell and flavor, as well as the soft, buttery texture. For something like the Greenland shark, which is the basis for Icelandic hokal, the process is even more extreme. The shark's flesh is naturally full of urea and trimethylenol oxide, which are essentially poisonous. To make it edible, the shark is buried in a shallow, gravelly pit and pressed with heavy stones for weeks. This squeezes out the toxic fluids. Then, it's hung to dry for several more months, during which it ferments and develops that signature, overwhelming ammonia smell. Eating it wasn't just a matter of taste, it was a matter of detoxifying a food source that would otherwise be lethal. Why on earth would anyone do this? The answer is simple: it works. It's an incredibly effective way to preserve fish, especially in environments where salt might be scarce or the weather isn't right for drying. The process creates an environment where harmful microbes can't survive, making the food safe to eat for a very long time. It was another tool in the survival kit, a way to turn a huge catch of fish into a stable source of calories and nutrients that could last through the winter. A little known fact about this process is its surprising nutritional benefit. While it sounds like you're eating rotten food, the fermentation process can actually increase the availability of certain vitamins. It's a form of pre-digestion, breaking down complex proteins into more easily absorbed amino acids. So while it may be an assault on the senses, it's a nutritionally dense and efficient food. Of course, the exact nature and prevalence of these extremely fermented foods in the Viking Age is a topic of ongoing academic debate. While the tradition is clearly ancient, the sagas are not exactly detailed recipe books. They might mention outdoor preserved fish, but the specific descriptions of the process are often vague. Archaeologists can find fish bones, but it's very difficult to tell from a bone whether the fish was salted, smoked, dried, or fermented into a pungent paste. Scholars have to work backward from modern traditional foods and assume a long history, but proving that a Viking in 900 AD was eating something identical to modern hokal is challenging. You manage to swallow the tiny piece of fish. The flavor lingers, a phantom of ammonia and salt that you feel you'll be tasting for days. You understand now. The Viking palate wasn't about pleasure in the way we think of it. It was a functional palate, trained to accept and even value flavors that we would find challenging or repulsive. Soreness, extreme saltness, overpowering smoke, and now, pungent fermentation. These weren't flaws in the food, they were the signatures of its safety, the taste of life itself. After this experience, the idea of a real feast, with actual roasted meat, seems like an impossible dream. But such things did happen. They were just rarer and more meaningful than the legends suggest. Your senses are still reeling from the fermented fish experience. The memory of that ammonia-ted tang is seared into your brain. The daily routine of porridge, hard bread, and preserved protein has become your reality. And then, one day, the mood in the longhouse shifts. There's a buzz of excitement, a palpable sense of anticipation. Word goes around that tonight is a sambiel, a true feast. This isn't just a bigger portion of porridge. This is an event. It might be to celebrate a successful raid, a wedding, or a religious festival like Yule at midwinter. These feasts were crucial punctuation marks in the long, monotonous sentence of daily life. They were a release valve, a way to reaffirm social bonds and, for one glorious night, to forget about rationing. As evening falls, the longhouse is transformed. The central fire is built up high, roaring and casting a bright, warm glow that pushes back the shadows. The air is still smoky, but tonight it's mixed with a new, intoxicating aroma, the smell of roasting meat. In the center of the hall, a whole pig or a sheep is being turned on a spit over the flames. The sound of the fat crackling and dripping into the fire is a kind of music you haven't heard in a long time. The sight of the meat slowly turning, its skin blistering on turning a deep, golden brown, is mesmerizing. This is the image we all have of a Viking feast. And for tonight, it's real. You take your seat on the bench, and the atmosphere is completely different. People are talking louder, laughing. The usual stoicism has been replaced with a boisterous energy. Wooden platters are brought out, piled high with thick slices of the freshly roasted meat. You're handed a piece, and it's warm and tender. The fat is soft, the skin is crispy, and the meat itself is juicy and rich with its own natural flavor. There's no overwhelming salt, no acrid smoke, no funky fermentation. It's just meat. And it tastes like the most incredible thing you've ever eaten. Alongside the roast, there might be other luxuries. Perhaps a side of precious butter to go with your bread, which suddenly seems less of a chore to eat. Maybe the porridge pot has been enriched with the drippings from the roast, turning the bland gruel into a savory, meaty stew. Someone might even bring out a small bowl of last summer's dried berries. Their sweetness a shocking and delightful contrast to the savory fat. This is a feast for the senses, a stark contrast to the daily fare, and it highlights a fundamental truth: the Vikings knew what good food tasted like. They didn't eat porridge and salt fish because they had no taste buds. They ate it because they had to. The very deliciousness of this feast is proof of the sacrifice that daily life entailed. This meal is special precisely because it's a rare departure from the norm. An interesting little detail about these feasts is what they didn't have. There would be no potatoes, no tomatoes, no corn on the cob. These are all New World crops that hadn't yet been introduced to Europe. The side dishes would be limited to what the local environment could provide, perhaps some boiled cabbage, onions, or hardy root vegetables. The focus was squarely on the meat and the fat, the most prized and calorie-dense foods. But was every feast centered around a magnificent whole roasted animal? This is where the sagas and archaeology sometimes paint different pictures. A classic point of contention for historians. The sagas, which are epic stories full of heroes and kings, love to describe these huge roasts. It's a powerful image. However, archaeological evidence from cooking pits often shows a different story. They frequently find heaps of fire-cracked rocks, which points to a different cooking method. Instead of roasting over a fire, which is actually a very inefficient way to cook, as you lose a lot of fat and juice to the flames, a more common heist at a cooking method may have been pit cooking. You dig a hole, line it with stones, and build a massive fire in it. Once the stones were glowing hot, you'd remove the embers, line the pit with green leaves or moss, put the meat in, perhaps wrapped in more leaves, cover it with more hot stones, and then bury the whole thing. It would slowly steam and cook in its own juices for hours. The result would be incredibly tender, flavorful meat, more like a modern pulled pork than a crispy skinned roast. It's less dramatic than a spit roast, but probably more effective and common. So the luxury of your feast isn't just about the type of food, but the sheer quantity. Tonight, you can eat until you are truly full, a feeling you may not have experienced for months. The social pressure to ration is temporarily lifted. This abundance was a display of the chieftain's wealth and generosity. By providing a feast like this, he was demonstrating his ability to care for his people, reinforcing their loyalty. The food was a tool of social cohesion. As you savor the last piece of tender, fatty meat, you realize the feast is about so much more than just eating. It's about community, celebration, and a temporary, blissful escape from the harsh realities of preservation. But the centerpiece of this feast, the roasted pig, also reminds you of a simple fact. The animals that sustained the Vikings were not the mythic beasts of legend. They were humble, hardy farm animals, a far cry from the great boars of Valhalla. The rich taste of roasted pork still lingers in your memory. A warm and pleasant ghost. It makes you think about the animals themselves. The sagas in popular culture are filled with images of Vikings hunting fearsome wild boars or feasting on massive sides of beef. But as you walk around the farmstead in the pale light of a winter morning, you see the reality, and it's a lot smaller and hardier. The pigs you see are not the giant, pink farm pigs of the modern world. They are lean, hairy, dark-colored creatures with long snouts and a distinctly wild look. They look more like a bristly cross between a domestic pig and a wild boar. These are the original Viking pigs. Animals bred for toughness, not for size. They would spend much of the year foraging for themselves in the woods, rooting for acorns, roots, and whatever else they could find. They were self-sufficient and perfectly adapted to the landscape. Their meat was leaner and likely had a more intense, gummy flavor than modern pork, which explains why that feast meat tasted so rich. Next to the pigsty, you see the sheep. Again, they are not the big, fluffy, white sheep you might expect. These are a smaller, more primitive breed, something like the modern Icelandic or Shetland sheep. They are incredibly hardy, with a double coat of wool that protects them from the harsh weather. They were a multi-purpose animal, a true cornerstone of the farm. They provided wool for clothing and sails, milk for cheese and skyr, and, of course, meat, mutton. The meat from an adult sheep was likely even more common than pork or beef because sheep were more efficient to raise on marginal land. And then there are the cows. The Viking cow was also smaller and more compact than a modern dairy or beef cow. Think of something like a Dexter or a small Highland cow. Raising cattle was a significant investment. A cow required a lot of high-quality pasture in the summer and a huge amount of stored fodder to get through the winter. For this reason, cattle were a status symbol. Owning a large herd of cattle was a clear sign of a wealthy and successful farmer. They were primarily valued for their milk, which, as you know, was the foundation of the dairy-based preservation economy. A cow would only be slaughtered for meat when it was old and no longer productive, or for a very important feast. The meat from such an animal would have been tough and lean. These were the mainstays of the Viking farm: the pig, the sheep, and the cow. They were accompanied by goats, which were even hardier than sheep and could survive on the poorest grazing land, and chickens, which were kept for their eggs and occasionally for their meat. A fun, little-known fact is about the color of their chickens. Based on analysis of ancient chicken bones and DNA, it seems that a common feature of Viking Age chickens was a genetic trait that gave them black bones and dark pigmented meat. So a roast chicken in the Viking Age might have been a rather gothic-looking affair, with dark, almost black flesh. Beyond the farm animals, there was hunting. But hunting was not the primary source of meat for most people. It was a supplement, not a staple. The image of the Viking hunter trekking through the wilderness is romantic, but farming was a much more reliable source of calories. The animals they hunted were the ones you'd expect in a northern forest: deer, elk, and reindeer. In the far north, the hunting of reindeer and marine mammals like seals and walruses was much more central to survival. But what about horses? Did they eat them? This is a really interesting and culturally sensitive question that historians still carefully navigate. The archaeological evidence is clear: yes, they did. Horse bones with butcher marks are found at Viking settlement sites. For most of pagan Germanic and Norse culture, there was nothing wrong with eating horse meat. In fact, it seems to have been associated with certain pagan religious rituals. This is where it gets complicated. When Christianity began to spread into Scandinavia, one of the first things the new religion tried to stamp out was the consumption of horse meat. The church associated it directly with pagan practices. In 732 AD, Pope Gregory III wrote a lectionary in Germany, Saint Boniface, explicitly forbidding the eating of horse meat, calling it a filthy and abominable custom. This prohibition became a sort of litmus test for conversion. If you stopped eating horse, it was a sign you had accepted the new faith. Therefore, The practice of eating horse meat slowly became taboo and died out as Scandinavia Christianized. The debate among historians continues on how quickly this change happened and how deeply the taboo was felt in different regions. So the animals that fueled the Viking Age were not mythical beasts. They were tough, practical, and perfectly adapted to their environment. They were a living, breathing part of the farm's ecosystem, each one providing a different set of resources to get you through the year. They were your partners in survival. But what happened when the preserved meat ran out? When the grain stores were low, and the animals were too precious to slaughter in those desperate times, you had to turn away from the farm and look to the frozen, unforgiving wilderness. The winter has been long, too long. You look into the storage bins, and the layer of grain at the bottom is perilously thin. The last of the salted meat was eaten a week ago. The smoked fish hanging in the rafters are all gone. This is the leanest time of year, late winter and early spring, when the preserved foods of last summer are running out. But nothing new has started to grow. This is the hunger gap. The stoic calm of the longhouse is replaced by a quiet, gnawing anxiety. The daily porridge is thinner, more watery, rations are cut. You feel a constant, hollow ache in your belly. This is the grim reality that the sagas rarely dwell on. Starvation was a real and recurring threat. When the carefully planned stores failed, you had only one option left: to turn to the wild. You pull on your wool cloak and leather boots and step out of the smoky warmth of the longhouse into the stark, cold landscape. The world is still mostly grey and brown, with patches of stubborn, dirty snow, but the iron grip of winter is beginning to loosen. The air feels different, a little softer. This is the time for desperate foraging. This isn't the pleasant, bountiful foraging of late summer. This is a search for anything, literally anything that is edible. You're not looking for delicious berries or flavorful mushrooms. You're looking for calories. You're looking for things that will fill the emptiness in your stomach and keep you going until the first green shoots of spring appear. You head for the forest's edge. Your eyes scan the ground, the trees, the frozen marshlands. You are part of a small group, mostly women and children, because the able-bodied men might be away hunting. A high-risk, high-reward gamble for big game. Foraging was the more reliable, if less glorious, safety net. Your first stop is a patch of last year's withered greens. You look for the tough, leathery leaves of plants you know are safe, like wild garlic or sorrel, hoping to find a few that have survived the winter under the snow. They are bitter and stringy, but they are food. You gather them into a leather pouch. You dig in the cold, damp earth near the base of a tree. Your fingers numb, searching for roots and tubers. You might find the small, starchy roots of dandelions or the tough, woody root of a thistle. These are not like a modern carrot or potato. They are fibrous, often bitter, and require a lot of processing to become edible. They'll need to be boiled for a long time to soften them and leach out some of the bitterness. This desperate search for food is a side of the Viking Age that is often ignored. We picture warriors, but we don't picture a hungry mother digging for bitter roots to feed her family. Yet, this was a far more common experience. The archaeological record backs this up. Analysis of the contents of Viking-era garbage pits and even the plaque on skeletal teeth shows a wide variety of wild plants were consumed, many of which we would consider weeds or famine foods today. A particularly strange and little-known food source would be lichens. Certain types of lichen, like Iceland moss, are actually edible and surprisingly high in carbohydrates. However, they are also full of bitter acids that need to be removed before consumption. The process was laborious. You would have to soak the lichen in water with wood ash, which is alkaline, for a long time, or boil it repeatedly, changing the water each time to make it palatable. The result would be a gelatinous, black, tar-like substance that could be mixed into the porridge to add bulk and nutrients. It probably tasted as appealing as it sounds, but it was a proven survival food in the far north for centuries. The very act of foraging was fraught with risk. The line between an edible plant and a poisonous one can be very thin. A mistake could lead to sickness or even death. This knowledge of wild plants, what to eat, what to avoid, and how to prepare it was a vital form of ancestral wisdom, passed down through generations. But was this knowledge always perfect? Historians studying botanical remains and suggers sometimes wonder about the prevalence of low-level poisoning from improperly prepared or misidentified plants. It's a difficult thing to prove, but it's likely that stomach aches and other ailments were a common result of a forager's gamble. As you scour the landscape, your gaze turns to the trees themselves. They stand bare and silent against the grey sky. To a modern eye, they are just wood, but to a starving Viking, they are a last resort. The forest is not just a source of fuel and building material. In the worst of times, the forest itself is food, and you're about to learn the bitter taste of that truth. Your leather pouch contains a meager collection of bitter leaves and muddy roots. It's not enough. The hunger is a physical presence, a cold knot in your stomach. Your gaze falls upon a birch tree, its white bark peeling in papery strips. You walk over to it, pull out a small, sharp knife, and do something that feels deeply counterintuitive. You begin to peel away the outer bark to get to the layer beneath. This is your next meal. You're going to eat the tree. This wasn't a sign of madness, it was a well-established, if desperate, survival strategy practiced across the northern hemisphere for centuries. The target isn't the rough outer bark, but the soft, pliable inner bark, known as the fold. This layer is responsible for transporting sugars and nutrients from the roots to the rest of the tree. In the spring, it's full of energy, making it the most nutritious part of the tree to eat. With your knife, you carefully strip away long ribbons of this pale, cambium layer. It's slightly sticky and has a faint, sweet, pine-like smell. But eating it raw is not the best idea. It's tough and fibrous. It needs to be processed. Back at the longhouse, the real work begins. The strips of inner bark are first laid out to dry, perhaps near the fire or in the rafters. Once they are completely dry and brittle, they are roasted or toasted until they are browned and crispy. This step is crucial, as it makes them easier to grind and improves the flavor, making it less resinous. The final step is to pound the toasted bark into a fine powder. You'd use a mortar and pestle to stones to grind it down into a coarse, brownish flour. This is bark bread, or more accurately, bark flour. This bark flour was almost never used on its own. It was an extender, a way to make the last dregs of your precious grain flour go further. You'd mix this bark flour with whatever barley or rye flour you had left, maybe in a 50-male ratio, or if things were really bad, an 80-male ratio. You'd then use this mixture to make the familiar, dense flatbreads. You are handed a piece of this bread. It's darker than usual, a deep, reddish brown. You take a bite. The texture is even rougher and more fibrous than the normal bread, but the most surprising thing is the taste. It's not as terrible as you might imagine. It has a slightly sweet, faintly piney flavor, but it is dominated by a powerful, lingering bitterness. It's an astringent taste that dries out your mouth. It doesn't taste like food. It tastes like medicine, or like chewing on a twig. The most common trees used for this were birch, elm, and pine. Elm was particularly prized, so much so that this practice might have contributed to the decline of elm populations in some parts of Scandinavia. This historical tidbit is a point of quiet fascination for paleobotanists and historians. Were Viking-era famines so severe that they literally changed the composition of the forests? It's a compelling theory that highlights the profound impact that human hunger can have on the environment. This practice of eating bark is even embedded in the language. The Sami people, the indigenous inhabitants of northern Scandinavia, have a long tradition of harvesting pine bark for food, and their vocabulary includes specific words for the tools and processes involved. It's a sign that this wasn't just a one-off, emergency measure, but a regular part of the seasonal cycle of survival in the harshest environments. But did this bark bread actually provide any real nutrition? This is a point of debate. While the foam layer does contain sugars and some minerals, Its main contribution was likely as a source of fiber and sheer bulk. It filled your stomach and could stave off the worst of the hunger pangs. However, it's very difficult for the human digestive system to break down cellulose, the main component of the bark. So, while it made you feel full, the actual caloric value was probably quite low. You could survive on it, but you wouldn't thrive. Some scholars argue that its main benefit was psychological. The act of making and eating bread, even if it was mostly tree, provided a sense of normalcy and hope in a desperate time. You slowly chew the bitter, fibrous bread. It's hard work. Each swallow feels like a victory against the gnawing hunger. This is the taste of the absolute bottom line of survival. It's the flavor of a world where there is no distinction between the forest and the pantry. When the fields are barren, the larder is empty. The trees themselves become your last hope. But the trees weren't the only thing the earth offered up in these lean times. Beneath your feet, buried in the cold soil, were other sources of food, equally bitter and just as vital. You've eaten the bark of a tree, and the bitter taste still clings to the roof of your mouth. The feeling of fullness it provides is hollow, unsatisfying. Your body craves something more substantial. The foraging party heads out again, this time towards the marshy ground near a sluggish, half-frozen stream. You're not looking up at the trees anymore, you're looking down. Armed with a sharpened digging stick, you begin to probe the cold, muddy earth. You're researching for the underground storage organs of plants' rhizomes, tubers, and bulbs. These are the parts of a plant that act as its own personal larder, storing energy to survive the winter. And now, you're going to steal the energy for yourself. After several minutes of prodding and digging in the muck, your stick hits something firm. You get down on your knees, your hands sinking into the icy mud, and pull it out. It's an old, brown, misshapen lump, covered in dirt and fine root hairs. It could be the rhizome of a cattle or the tuber of a silverweed plant. It doesn't look like food. It looks like a clod of earth. You gather a pouch full of these muddy treasures and take them back to the longhouse. Like the bark, they require careful processing. First, they must be washed meticulously to remove the grit and mud. Then comes the peeling, a tedious task with a small knife, removing the tough, fibrous outer skin. What you're left with is the pale, starchy flesh of the root. You slice one open. It's dense and watery. You take a tiny, tentative nibble of a raw piece. The flavor is to fold a bland, starchy taste, followed by a wave of intense, unpleasant bitterness. Some of these wild roots contain bitter or even mildly toxic compounds as a defense mechanism against being eaten. The Vikings knew this, and they knew that the key to making them edible was, as always, a long and patient cooking process. The roots are tossed into the cauldron of simmering water, the same pot used for the daily porridge. They are boiled, and boiled, and boiled. Sometimes the water would be changed multiple times to help leach out the bitter compounds. After a very long time, they become soft enough to mash. The result is a lumpy, greyish paste. You are given a spoonful of this root mash. The texture is starchy and slightly gluey, a bit like overworked mashed potatoes. The flavor is predominantly earthy. It tastes of mud, of damp soil, of the dark place it came from. The long boiling has removed the worst of the bitterness, but a faint, unpleasant aftertaste remains. There is no salt to season it. There is no butter to enrich it. This is it. Pure, unadorned, boiled root starch. This reliance on for-aged roots is well documented in the archaeological record through a science called paleobotany. By analyzing pollen and preserved plant fragments from Viking sites, scientists can build a picture of the local flora and what was being consumed. They find evidence of plants like biscuit and silverweed, whose starchy roots were a known famine food in many parts of Europe. A particularly curious detail revolves around the water lily. It might seem like a purely ornamental plant, but its large, starchy rhizomes, which grow in the mud at the bottom of ponds and slow-moving rivers, are edible. However, They are also quite bitter and require extensive processing, soaking, boiling, and grinding to be turned into a usable flour. Imagine the desperation required to wade into freezing cold water to harvest these muddy roots from the bottom of a pond. It's a testament to their resilience and their deep knowledge of the natural world. But was the nutrition worth the effort? This is a point of academic discussion. On one hand, these tubers were a vital source of carbohydrates at a time of year when no other starches were available. They provided the raw energy needed to survive. On the other hand, the net energy gain might have been surprisingly small. When you factor in the calories burned by digging for hours in the cold and then processing and cooking the roots for an equally long time, the final meal might have offered only a marginal surplus of energy. The debate continues whether these were a true solution to hunger or just a way to keep busy and fill the stomach. A psychological crutch against the despair of famine. You swallow another spoonful of the earthy, slightly bitter mash. It's warm, and it's filling a void. It is profoundly unsatisfying from a culinary perspective, but your body recognizes it as fuel. This is the taste of the earth itself. A direct transfer of stored solar energy from a plant's survival stash into your own. It is the flavor of desperation, but also the flavor of ingenuity. And as you eat, you dream of the day when the ground will once again produce food that is planted on purpose. Not for aged in despair food from the one part of the farm that offered a small splash of green in a world of brown and grey, the kitchen garden. Eventually, the world outside begins to change. The days grow longer, the snow finally melts away, and the first tentative shoots of green appear. The desperate foraging for bark and bitter roots subsides, replaced by the promise of cultivated food. But before the main grain crops are ready, the first place to show signs of life is the kitchen garden. This wasn't a sprawling field of diverse vegetables. The Viking kitchen garden, or Kallgard, literally cabbage yard, was a small, practical plot of land, usually close to the longhouse and often enclosed by a simple wattle fence to keep out hungry animals. It was the domain of the women of the household, and it was dedicated to growing a few hardy, reliable vegetables that could withstand the northern climate. And the undisputed king of this garden, as its name suggests, was the cabbage. You're handed a bowl of boiled greens. It's a simple dish, just leaves boiled in water, maybe with a pinch of salt if you're lucky. The leaves are a dull olive green from the cooking, soft and watery. You take a bite, the flavor is mild, slightly sweet, but with that characteristic, slightly sulfurous taste of the cabbage family. It's not exciting, it's not dynamic, but after a winter of preserved foods and bitter for aged greens, the taste of something genuinely fresh, no matter how simple, is a revelation. The cabbages grown by the Vikings weren't the tight, dense heads we know today. They were likely looser, leafier varieties, more akin to a modern kale or collard greens. They were incredibly resilient, able to survive late frosts, and they were a vital source of vitamins and minerals that would have been sorely lacking after a long winter. This humble bowl of boiled cabbage was a powerful medicine against deficiency diseases like scurvy. Alongside the cabbage, you would find a few other stalwarts. Onions and garlic were common, prized for their strong flavors and their excellent storage qualities. They could be harvested in the autumn and kept for months in a cool, dry place, providing a bit of pungent flavor to the monotonous winter diet. You might also find broad beans and peas, which were usually grown to be dried and added to the porridge pot for a protein boost. And that was about it. The variety was stunningly limited. There were no carrots as we know them, the sweet, orange variety hadn't been developed yet. Ancient carrots were thin, tough, and often purple or white. No lettuce, no spinach, no broccoli. The Viking vegetable patch was a study in pragmatism, not diversity. One interesting, lesser-known vegetable they likely cultivated was a plant called sea kale cranberry maritima. This is a wild coastal plant with large, fleshy, bluish-green leaves. It's naturally salt-tolerant and incredibly tough. The Vikings, being a coastal people, would have been very familiar with it. When cultivated, the young shoots can be blanched covered with a pot to exclude light to make them white and tender, with a nutty, delicate flavor. It's a gourmet vegetable today. But for the Vikings, it was just another hardy, reliable green to get them through the year. The preparation of these vegetables was, as you can guess, incredibly simple. The default method for almost everything was boiling. The ever-present cauldron would be put to use, simmering the cabbage or onions until they were soft. Roasting vegetables was not a common practice, as it required more attention and fuel. Salads were not a concept. The idea of eating fresh, raw leaves was foreign. Cooking was seen as a way to make food safer and more digestible. This brings up a small debate among food historians: how fresh were their fresh vegetables? While they certainly enjoyed them in the summer, a huge portion of the cabbage harvest would have been destined for preservation. One common method would have been to simply dry the leaves, creating vegetable hay that could be rehydrated in stews later. Another, more pungent, option was fermentation. The Vikings were likely making a form of sauerkraut, chopping the cabbage, salting it, and packing it into crocks to ferment. This would not only preserve the cabbage but also enhance its vitamin content and add a new, sour flavor to the culinary repertoire. So even the fresh taste of the garden was often transformed into the familiar, functional taste of preservation. You finish your bowl of boiled cabbage. It's a simple, honest flavor. It's the taste of the earth waking up. It represents the end of the hunger gap and the beginning of a season of relative abundance. It's a reminder that not everything in the Viking diet was brown or grey. There were flashes of green, moments of freshness. But as you look around at the meal, the porridge, the bread, the boiled greens, you can't help but notice the profound absence of one particular taste, a flavor that we take for granted in almost every meal today: the taste of sweetness. You've experienced the full spectrum of Viking flavors: salty, smoky, sour, bitter, and earthy. Your palate has been stretched and challenged. But now, you notice a profound and persistent void, a missing piece of the culinary puzzle. There is no sweetness. A concept of dessert doesn't exist. There are no sugary treats, no candied snacks, no sweet pastries. You are living in an almost completely sugar-free world. Imagine your daily diet. The porridge is unsweetened. The bread is savory and slightly sour. The drinks are tangy or watery. The preserved meats and fish are salty. The vegetables are earthy and sulfurous. Your taste buds, accustomed to a modern diet where sugar is hidden in almost everything, are in a state of shock. They keep searching for a sweet note that never arrives. The reason is simple: there were no sugar beets and no sugar cane in Viking Age Scandinavia. Refined sugar, the white crystalline powder that defines modern desserts, was a rare and astronomically expensive spice imported from the Arab world, available only to the richest kings and emperors in the far south of Europe. For you, here in the north, it might as well not exist. So, was life completely devoid of sweetness? Not entirely, but the sources of it were natural, seasonal, and incredibly precious. Your primary source of intense sweetness was honey. Beekeeping was practiced, but it was a specialized and somewhat risky endeavor. Hives were often kept in shielded areas of the forest. Raiding a wild beehive was another option, but a dangerous one. As a result, honey was a luxury item. It was a treasure. It wasn't something you'd stir into your porridge every morning. It was used sparingly, as a special treat, a medicine, or for brewing the most high-status alcoholic beverage of all, mead. A spoonful of honey, drizzled over a piece of bread or mixed with fresh skyr, would have been an explosion of flavor, a rare moment of pure indulgence. The other main source of sweetness came from fruit. But again, the options were limited by the climate. The most common fruits were wild berries, harvested with frantic intensity during their short season in the late summer. You would have spent days on the hillsides and in the forests, picking wild strawberries, which were much smaller and more intensely flavored than modern varieties. Bilberries, a close relative of the blueberry, lingonberries, and cloudberries, Cloudberries are a fascinating example of a uniquely northern treasure. These amber-colored berries grow in acidic bogs and marshland. They have a unique taste that is both sweet and tart, and they are rich in vitamin C. Even today, they are considered a delicacy. For the Vikings, they were a seasonal bonanza. But what did you do with all these berries? You couldn't eat them all fresh, they would spoil quickly. Some would be eaten immediately, a glorious, sun-warmed treat, but the majority were preserved. The most common method was simply to dry them, spreading them out on cloths or leather hides in the sun or near the fire. These dried berries would become hard, chewy little nuggets of concentrated sweetness, to be doled out sparingly during the winter to liven up a bland meal. Another method was to mash them and store them in crocks, sometimes mixed with a little honey to help preserve them. Domesticated fruit was less common. Certain hardy varieties of apples and plums could be grown in the more sheltered parts of Scandinavia. An orchard was a sign of a well-established and prosperous farm. The apples wouldn't have been the large, uniform sweet globes we have today, but smaller, tartar, and more resilient varieties. These, too, would be dried or cooked down into a thick sauce for preservation. This lack of sugar had a surprising, and rather positive, side effect. Without sugar, dental cavities were significantly less common, while the Vikings suffered from extreme tooth wear due to their gritty diet. They had remarkably low rates of tooth decay. It's a strange trade-off. Your teeth might be ground down to stumps, but at least they wouldn't be rotten. This is a detail that dental anthropologists, studying ancient skulls, consistently point out. The scarcity of sweetness is a fundamental aspect of the Viking palate that we often forget. It reshapes the very definition of a treat. A treat wasn't a complex, sugary confection. A treat was a single, perfect wild strawberry. A treat was a small, sour apple. A treat was a finger dipped in a pot of precious honey. The value of sweetness was amplified by its rarity. This fundamental lack of sweetness is something historians are confident about. But there's a subtle debate on the fringes. Did they use other, more obscure sources of sweetness? Some point to the natural sweetness of certain roots, like parsnips, or the sweet juice that can be tapped from birch trees in the spring, a practice that yields a much less concentrated syrup than maple. These would have provided a very mild, subtle sweetness, far from the intensity of honey. The scholarly consensus is that these were minor contributors. For all practical purposes, the Viking world ran on savory, and sweetness was a fleeting, golden exception. And so, but humans are ingenious. Even with a limited pantry, you would have tried to make your food more interesting. You would have turned to the only other source of flavor available, the wild and cultivated herbs grown at your doorstep. You've reconciled yourself to a life without sugar, a world where flavor is defined by the processes of preservation. The blandness of the daily porridge has become a familiar, if an inspiring, baseline. But surely, you think, they must have tried to spice things up a little. Surely, they didn't just accept the monotony. They did try. But their spice rack was not the exotic collection of a Roman merchant. It was their local fields and forests. The spices of the Viking Age were the humble, hardy herbs and seeds that could be cultivated in their kitchen gardens or foraged from the wild. These were not the bold, transformative flavors of pepper or cinnamon. They were subtle, nuanced, and used with a light hand. You watch as someone prepares the evening porridge. Before serving, they reach into a small leather pouch and sprinkle a pinch of dried, greenish-brown flakes and some tiny seeds into the cauldron. They stir it in. It's not a dramatic change, but a faint, new aroma rises with the steam, a hint of anise, a touch of dill. When you get your bowl, you taste the difference. It's still the same gritty, bland porridge, but now there's a ghost of another flavor haunting the edges. A slight, savory warmth, a whisper of freshness. It's not a revolution, but it's an improvement. It's enough to make the meal feel different from yesterday's. What was in that pouch? The archaeological and botanical evidence gives us a good idea of the Viking herb garden. One of the most common finds is coriander. Both the leafy green cilantro and the dried seeds would have been used. The seeds, with their raw, citrusy, and slightly spicy flavor, would have been especially valuable as they could be stored all winter. Dill is another classic Scandinavian flavor with ancient roots. Its feathery leaves and pungent seeds would have been used to flavor fish dishes on the soupy grautyr. Its fresh, slightly sharp taste would have been a welcome contrast to the heavy, oily flavors of preserved food. Mustard seeds were also cultivated. They could be ground into a paste or used whole to add a pungent heat to a meal, a bit of sharp, sinus-clearing mustard would have been a powerful tool to cut through the richness of fatty meat or to liven up the blandest of foods. Beyond these cultivated herbs, there was foraging. Horseradish, growing wild, would have provided an even more intense, fiery heat than mustard. Its powerful root could be grated and used sparingly to add a real kick to a dish. Juniper berries, plucked from evergreen shrubs, would have offered a piney, peppery, and slightly bitter flavor, a natural pairing for gourmet meats. A particularly interesting and somewhat unexpected find from Viking era excavations in Britain and Dublin is the common garden weed, Fathinch Enopodium album. The seeds of this plant have been found in large quantities, suggesting they weren't just an accidental contaminant in the grain. It's likely they were deliberately harvested and used as a food source, perhaps cooked into a porridge like gruel or ground into a dark, nutty flour. The leaves are also edible, much like their close relative, spinach. It's a classic example of a weed being a valuable food crop. So they had these flavors. Why wasn't the food more vibrant? Part of the reason is that many of these herbs were also seen as medicinal. Their use might have been more for health and digestion than for pure culinary pleasure. A pinch of dill might be added to a meal not just for taste, but because it was believed to soothe an upset stomach. The other reason is one of scale and intensity. The flavors of these northern herbs are generally more delicate and subtle than the powerful spices of the east. A pinch of ground coriander seed just doesn't have the same impact as a crack of black pepper. Black pepper, the king of spices, was known to the Vikings. It was an incredibly high-status luxury good, obtained through long-distance trade routes that stretched all the way to Russia and Byzantium. A chieftain might have a few precious peppercorns, which he would display as a sign of his wealth and worldliness. But for you, in this ordinary longhouse, pepper is just a rumor, a story of a magical seed that tastes like fire. The true extent and variety of their spice use is a topic still being gently teased out by archaeologists. The evidence is often frustratingly indirect. Finding tiny seeds and pollen requires meticulous excavation techniques, and it's easy to miss. There's an ongoing debate, for example, about garlic. While it was known and used, was it a common, everyday flavoring, or was it a more specialized, high-status ingredient? The sources sometimes mention it in the context of chieftains' meals, but it's hard to say how far down the social ladder its use extended. You scrape the last of the herb-scented porridge from your bowl. That faint hint of dill and coriander was a small mercy, a brief distraction from the blandness. It was a reminder that even in a world of limited ingredients, the human desire for variety and flavor never truly disappears. It just adapts. But there was one area where flavor took a back seat to a different, more potent goal. That was in the brewing of beverages, where the real prize wasn't taste, but transformation. The feast is in full swing. The roast meat has been devoured, stories are being told, and the boisterous energy in the longhouse is rising. Now, the drinking horns are brought out. These are not the crude, oversized horns of fantasy movies, but polished, often beautifully carved horns from cattle, passed from hand to hand down the benches. This is the heart of the Sumbiel, the ritualized drinking ceremony, and the drink being served tonight is the most legendary beverage of the Viking Age mead. A drinking horn is passed to you. It's cool and smooth to the touch, and surprisingly heavy. You lift it to your lips and take a sip of the golden liquid inside. You're expecting the sweet, nectar-like flavor that the poets sing about, the nectar of the gods. The reality is a little different. The mead is sweet, yes, but it's not a cloying sweetness. It's a deep, complex sweetness from the honey, but it's followed by a distinct alcoholic warmth and a slightly sharp, tangy, or even sour finish from the fermentation. It might also have a faint, herbal or floral aftertaste from the specific type of honey used or from other things that were added to the brew. It doesn't taste like a soft drink, it tastes like a serious, potent alcoholic beverage. Mead, at its most basic, is simply a mixture of honey and water that has been fermented with yeast. It sounds simple, but creating a good, stable mead was an art form. The Vikings were master brewers, but they were working without modern equipment or scientific understanding of microbiology. Their yeast would have been a wild, domesticated strain, perhaps harvested from the froth of a previous batch or living in the very wood of the brewing vats. This house culture of yeast would give each brewer's mead a unique and sometimes unpredictable character. Because honey was such a precious commodity, high quality, pure mead was a high status drink. It was the drink of chieftains, of poets, of sacred rituals. It was what you drank on the most important occasions. For a chieftain to serve mead at a feast was a display of wealth and power. It showed he had enough of the valuable resource of honey to turn it into a drink, rather than just use it as a sweetener. A fun, slightly quirky detail about mead is the variety of things they might have added to it. Archaeologists have analyzed the residue from drinking horns and brewing vessels and found pollen from a wide range of plants. Some of these were likely flavorings. They might have added meadows water flower that gives a lovely almond-like scent, yarrow, or even the bog myrtle you've heard about before. But some of the additions were more psychoactive. There is evidence for the use of henbane, a plant that can cause hallucinations under feeling of euphoria or flight. This has led to speculation that certain ritual meads were deliberately brewed to be mind-altering, to help commune with the gods or to fuel the frenzy of elite warrior groups. But was all mead a super sweet, high-alcohol powerhouse? This is where the historical picture gets a bit more nuanced, and where scholars have some gentle disagreements. The sagas talk about mead as this ultimate drink, but it's likely that the term covered a wide range of honey-based fermented beverages. A chieftain's ceremonial mead might be strong and sweet, made with a high ratio of honey to water, but a more common, everyday version might have been much weaker and drier, meaning more of the sugar had been fermented out, made with less honey, or even with a mixture of honey and fruit juice, creating a beverage called a mellow. The quality would also have been wildly inconsistent. Without modern sanitation and temperature control, a batch of mead could easily go wrong. It could turn unpleasantly sour from bacterial contamination, or the fermentation could stall, leaving a sickly sweet, low-alcohol syrup. For every perfect horn of divine mead, there were probably a few disappointing batches that still got drunk anyway, because you didn't waste the honey. You take another sip from the horn. The alcoholic warmth spreads through your chest, and the noise in the longhouse seems to get a little friendlier, a little less harsh. You understand the appeal. This wasn't just about getting drunk. It was a social lubricant, a ritual element, and a taste of luxury in a world that had very little of it. But this drink, this legendary mead, was for special occasions only. It wasn't what you drank every day. Your daily thirst would be quenched by its much humbler, much more common, and much less glamorous cousin. The memory of the rich, honeyed mead from the feast is a pleasant, distant buzz, but today is just another day. The work is hard, your throat is dry, and you need something to drink. The water in the nearby stream is clear, but drinking untreated water is always a bit of a gamble. It could harbor invisible bacteria that could make you seriously ill, and in a world without antibiotics, a bad case of dysentery could be a death sentence. So what do you drink? You're handed a cup of the standard, everyday beverage for everyone, from children to elders. Ale. You look into the simple wooden cup. The liquid is cloudy and pale, straw-like brown. There are no bubbles. This is not a carbonated beverage. You take a sip. It's not the crisp, hoppy flavor of a modern beer. The first thing you notice is that it's served at ambient temperature, not chill. The flavor is malty and slightly sweet from the barley, but it's followed by a distinct sourness, a lactic tang, much like the soured milk you become accustomed to. It's thin, watery, and has a very low alcohol content, probably only 1–2%. This is Viking's small beer, or light ale. It was the hydration station of the Viking Age. It was made by taking grains, usually barley, but sometimes oats or rye, and allowing them to sprout. A process called malting which develops the enzymes needed to convert starches to fermentable sugars. The malted grain was then mashed with hot water, and the resulting sugary liquid, or murt, was boiled and left to ferment with wild yeast. The key thing to understand is that this ale was brewed primarily for safety, not for intoxication. The process of boiling the wort killed off any harmful pathogens from the water. The fermentation process then populated the liquid with yeast and beneficial bacteria, creating an acidic environment where new, harmful microbes couldn't get a foothold. The small amount of alcohol also acted as a mild preservative. The result was a drink that was safer to consume than most available water sources. It was also a source of calories and B vitamins, making it a nutritious part of the daily diet. Every farmstead would have brewed its own ale. It was a constant, ongoing task, as essential as baking bread or making porridge. The quality and flavor would vary enormously from one household to another, depending on their specific grain, their water source, and most importantly, their unique strain of yeast, or kvik. Kvik is a fascinating piece of living history. It's a type of yeast that was passed down through generations of Norwegian farmhouse brewers. For centuries, after each batch of brewing, the thick layer of yeast would be scraped, often dried on a wooden ring or log. This dried, dormant yeast could be stored for a year or more, ready to be awakened for the next brew. What makes kvik extraordinary, as modern science has discovered, is its ability to ferment at incredibly high temperatures without producing off flavors, and to do so very, very quickly. It's a super yeast, perfectly adapted to the rustic, no-nonsense brewing conditions of the farmhouse. The ale you're drinking was almost certainly fermented with a similar kind of ancient, domesticated super yeast. But was the ale always this thin and sour? Here lies a classic historical debate. The sagas are full of references to strong, potent ale that makes warriors boast and poets sing. So were there two kinds of ale? The current consensus is yes. There was this small beer for daily hydration, then there was strong ale for feasts on special occasions. Strong ale would be made using a much higher ratio of grain to water, resulting in a more sugary wort, which in turn would ferment into a much more alcoholic and flavorful beverage. It would have been richer, maltier, and more intoxicating, a true party drink, second only to the luxurious mead. The one major flavor missing from your cup is bitterness. Most modern beers are bitter red with hops. Hops act as a preservative and provide that characteristic beery flavor. But, in the Viking Age, the use of hops was not yet widespread in Scandinavia. While they knew of the plant, it wasn't a standard ingredient. Instead, to balance the sweetness of the malt and add some preservative qualities, they would use a mixture of other herbs and botanicals called greuet. The exact recipe for greuet varied, but it often included plants like yarrow, bog myrtle, and heather. This is what gave the ale its subtly herbal, sometimes medicinal, and distinctly non-hoppy flavor profile. You drain your cup of the thin, sour ale. It's refreshing in its own way. It quenches your thirst and doesn't leave you feeling intoxicated or sluggish. It's the perfect drink for a working day. It's the taste of practicality, of safety, of liquid bread. It's the quiet, reliable beverage that washed down all those challenging meals. And it was this ale, along with the hard bread and the dried fish, that would have to sustain you on the most defining of all Viking experiences, a long and arduous journey at sea. The time has come. The ice has retreated from the fjord. The winds are favorable, and the longship is ready. It sits low in the water, a sleek and beautiful vessel, its dragon-headed prow pointing towards the open sea. You are joining the crew on a voyage. It could be for trade, for exploration, or for a raid, whatever the purpose. You are about to spend weeks, or even months, living on this open boat. And you have to eat. You climb aboard, finding your spot on a wooden sea chest that serves as both your storage locker and your rowing bench. There is no galley, no kitchen, no shelter from the elements. This is a stripped-down machine for travel. And the food situation is just as Spartan. What's in your lunchbox for a multi-week journey across the unforgiving North Sea? You open your sea chest. Inside, there is no barrel of salted pork or keg of fresh water. Such things are too heavy and take up too much space. The rations for a long sea voyage have to be the most efficient, lightweight, and durable foods in the Viking arsenal. The first thing you see is a large quantity of what you now know as stockfish. The raw cod, air-dried cod. It's the perfect sea ration. It's incredibly lightweight, takes up minimal space, and is packed with protein. It's virtually immune to spoilage from the sea spray and damp air. This is your primary source of protein for the journey. Next to it is a pile of dark, dense flatbread. This is the hardtack of the Viking world. The traveling bread you saw hanging in the rafters, baked to be as dry and hard as possible to prevent mold. It's a brick of carbohydrates, designed for maximum longevity. You also have a leather pouch filled with wind-dried jerky, the tough, leathery strips of salted undead-dried meat. Like the stockfish, it's a lightweight and durable source of protein and fat. And what about the bog butter? You have a small wooden pot of it. Its pungent, cheesy flavor will be a welcome source of calories and fat, smeared on the hard bread to make it slightly more palatable. It doesn't need refrigeration and its strong flavor is likely impervious to the other smells on the boat. For hydration, you have a water skin filled with the familiar no alcohol ale. It's safer than water and provides a few extra calories. When that runs out, you'll have to rely on rainwater collected in a sail, or rationed water from the barrels that are reserved for the longest stretches of open sea. This is it. This is your menu for the foreseeable future. Dried fish, pie bread, jerky, and funky butter. There is no cooking fire on a Viking longship. An open flame on a wooden boat packed with flammable tar and sailcloth would be suicidal, so all your food must be eaten cold, as is. The daily routine at sea is grueling. Hours of rowing, punctuated by moments of terror or boredom. When it's time to eat, you take out a piece of stockfish. You can't even beat it with a mallet here. You simply gnaw on the end of it, slowly scraping off fibers with your teeth. You break off a piece of the hard bread and chew on it until your jaw aches, slowly softening it with your own saliva. It's a joyless, mechanical process of refueling. This diet, monotonous and tough as it was a marvel of food science. It was a perfectly designed system of preserve, portable calories, but it was also nutritionally incomplete. The almost total lack of vitamin C would have made scurvy a constant threat on very long voyages. This is where a small, often overlooked ration comes in. In your chest, you might have a tiny pouch of dried sorrel leaves or a small crock of fermented cabbage. These are acidic, vitamin-rich foods were the Viking equivalent of a lime for a British sailor. A small mouthful could be enough to keep the worst symptoms of scurvy, bleeding gums, loose teeth, and lethargy at bay. The logistics of feeding a longship crew is a topic of great interest to maritime archaeologists and historians. How much food could they actually carry? Calculations based on the likely space available in sea chests and under tarps suggest they could carry enough of these dried provisions to last for several weeks. But what happened on longer journeys, like the multi-stage voyage to Iceland, Greenland, or North America? This is where the debate lies. Did they rely solely on what they could carry? Or was their strategy based on coasting? Whenever possible, the latter seems more likely. They would sail along a coastline, pulling into a friendly or unguarded shore at night to make camp. Here, they could build a fire, boil some of the stockfish into a proper soup, forage for fresh greens, hunt, and replenish their water supplies. The ship's ration was for the open sea crossings, the unavoidable sprints across blue water. The rest of the time, they lived off the land and sea as they went. Use it on your bench, gnawing on your piece of jerky. The salts break hold on your face. The dragon-headed prow rises and falls with the grey, swelling waves. The taste in your mouth is salty, tough, and relentlessly monotonous. This is the flavor of adventure. It's the taste that powered the expansion of the Viking world. And this punishing diet, day after day, week after week, was taking a silent, grinding toll on the very tools you were using to eat it. You're back on solid ground, the memory of the sea's relentless motion still faintly echoing in your sense of balance. You sit down for a meal, the familiar porridge and hard bread, and as you chew, you become aware of a dull, persistent ache in your jaw. A molar in the back of your mouth feels sensitive, and when you probe it with your tongue, you feel a rough, flattened surface where there should be peaks and valleys. This is the hidden cost of the Viking diet. It was a diet that was incredibly tough on your teeth. The constant grinding of coarse, gritty food, day in and day out, acted like a relentless file, slowly but surely wearing away your dental enamel. Take a moment to feel your own teeth. The molars have a complex landscape of cusps and fissures, designed for efficient chewing. Now, imagine that landscape being systematically sanded down over years. This is exactly what happened to the Vikings. The science of paleopathology, which studies diseases and health in ancient populations, has given us a clear and uncomfortable window into the state of Viking mouths. When archaeologists examine Viking skulls, one of the most consistent findings is severe dental attrition. The chewing surfaces of the teeth are often worn completely flat. In older individuals, the wear can be so extreme that the enamel is gone entirely, exposing the softer dentin beneath. Sometimes, the wear goes all the way down to the pulp cavity, the central part of the tooth containing the nerves and blood vessels. This would have been excruciatingly painful and the gateway for infection. What exactly was causing this? It was a perfect storm of abrasive elements. First, the stone ground flour. As you learned, the simple quern stones used to grind grain constantly shed small particles of grit and sand into the flour. This turned every mouthful of bread and porridge into a fine-grade sandpaper. Second, the food itself was tough. The hard-tack bread required powerful, prolonged chewing. The dried jerky and stockfish were leathery and fibrous, demanding incredible effort from the jaw muscles and putting immense pressure on the teeth. Even the fresh foods were often full of great vegetables pulled from the earth and, not washed with the obsessive hygiene we practice today, would retain traces of soil and sand. An interesting unspecific detail that researchers have found is a particular pattern of wear on the front teeth, especially in female skeletons. They often find tiny, horizontal grooves etched into the incisors. For a long time, the cause was a mystery. Now, the prevailing theory is that these marks come from textile work. Women would have spent countless hours spinning wool into thread, and it's believed they would use their front teeth to pull the fibers taut or to hold the spindle, leading to this distinctive groove pattern over a lifetime of work. It's a fascinating example of how your occupation could be written directly onto your skeleton. But what about cavities? As you know, the lack of sugar in their diet meant that tooth decay was much less of a problem than it is today. They were trading one dental problem for another. However, that doesn't mean their mouths were healthy. The severe wear and tear created other issues. The constant pressure could lead to microfractures in the teeth. When the pulp was exposed, it could easily become infected, leading to painful abscesses, pockets of pus forming in the jawbone at the root of the tooth. An abscess would be a serious, life-threatening medical event. In the skeletal record, archaeologists can see the evidence: small holes in the jawbone where an abscess has drained, or signs of bone infection, osteomyelitis spreading from the rotten tooth, without antibiotics or modern dentistry. A bad tooth wasn't just an inconvenience, it could kill you. This constant dental stress is a topic of ongoing research. How did they cope with the pain? The sagas are mostly silent on the matter of toothaches, but they must have been a common misery. Did they have folk remedies, perhaps chewing on certain herbs with anesthetic properties? Like yarrow or clove, though clove would have been an incredibly rare import. But mostly, you would just have to endure it. The debate among paleopathologists now isn't if they had bad teeth, but how much this chronic pain and infection affected their overall health, quality of life, and even their temperament. Imagine trying to be a fearsome warrior when you have a raging abscess in your jaw. You finish your meal. The ache in your jaw a dull throb. You look at the people around you in the longhouse, their faces weathered and stoic. You realize that behind many of those stoic expressions, there was likely a similar, private world of pain. It was just another hardship to be borne. Another price to be paid for survival in a tough world. The food kept you alive, but it demanded a steep, grinding payment from the very bones in your mouth. And it is this shared experience of hardship and survival that gives the communal feast its true, profound meaning. The memory of your aching jaw and the monotonous daily meals makes the very idea of a feast seem more sacred than ever. You find yourself back in the longhouse on a festive night. The fire roars, the drinking horns are being passed, and the air is thick with the smell of roasting meat and the sound of boisterous talk. This time, you see the event through different eyes. You realize this isn't really about the food. Yes, the taste of fresh roasted, fatty meat is a glorious relief from the daily grind of preserved rations. But the true purpose of the feast, the sunbiel, is social. It's the glue that holds this tough, competitive, and often fractured society together. It's a carefully orchestrated piece of social theater where everyone has a role to play. You watch the chieftain. He sits in his high seat, the best spot by the fire. He is the one who has provided the food and drink, a clear and public demonstration of his wealth and, more importantly, his generosity. A good chieftain was expected to be a ring giver, one who shared his wealth with his followers. This feast is an extension of that principle. By feeding his people, he is renewing his contract with them. He provides for them, and in return, they owe him their loyalty in work and in battle. The seating arrangement, which you noticed on your first day, is now starkly obvious. The most important warriors in the chieftain's family are close to him, sharing the best cuts of meat and getting the first pass of the drinking horn. The further you are from the center, the lower your status. A visitor's importance could be judged instantly by where they were invited to sit. It's a living map of the social hierarchy, reaffirmed with every meal. Then, the formal part of the evening begins. This is not just a drunken party, it's a ceremony. The chieftain stands and raises his drinking horn. He makes a toast to the gods, like Odin or Thor, for victory, or to Freyja for fertility and a good harvest. This is the first toast, a sacred act that connects the whole to the divine. Then, the horn is passed. As each person drinks, they can make a boast GYLP or an oath yet straining. This is a crucial part of the ceremony. A warrior might stand and boast of his accomplishments in a recent battle, reminding everyone of his prowess. Another might make a solemn oath to perform a great deed in the coming year, to lead an erring voyage, to avenge a slight, or to defeat a rival. These weren't just drunken ramblings. These oaths, made publicly in the sacred space of the feast, were considered magically binding. To fail to live up to your oath was a source of profound shame. You were literally putting your honor on the line in front of your entire community. It was a way of creating ambition, of driving the culture of achievement and fame that was so central to the Viking mindset. The role of women in these feasts is a subject of fascinating scholarly debate. In the sagas, high-status women, the ladies of the whole, often play a vital, active role. They are not just passive observers. They are the ones who formally carry and present the drinking horn, acting as peace weavers, their movement helping to soothe the aggressive, competitive male energy in the room. By choosing who to serve and in what order, they could subtly influence the social dynamics. The historical accuracy of this specific role as depicted in the epic poems is debated. Were they really this influential? Or is this a literary idealization? But it's clear they were central participants, not just servants. A curious detail of the feast is the presence of the Thul, or the skald, the poet and storyteller. After the toasts and oaths, the whole would fall silent to listen to them. The skald would recite epic poems, tales of gods and heroes, or compose new verses on the spot, praising the generosity of the chieftain and the bravery of his warriors. This was the entertainment, but it was also the history lesson and the news report all in one. It was how the culture's values were transmitted. A good chieftain would reward a talented skald with rich gifts, because the poet had the power to ensure the chieftain's fame would live on long after he was gone. You look around the hall. You see the bonds being forged and reforged. Old arguments are being settled. New alliances are being made. And a collective identity is being shaped. The shared experience of eating this rare, luxurious food, of drinking the strong ale and mead, of listening to the same stories, it all works to turn a group of individuals into a cohesive whole. The food, in the end, is just the catalyst. The feast is not a celebration of food. It's a celebration with food. It's a necessary ritual to counteract the isolating, grinding reality of a life dictated by scarcity. And as you look back on the entire culinary journey, you realize that this terrible food, in its own way, was the bedrock of it all. The embers of the feast fire are glowing low, and the longhouse is quiet again, settling back into its daily rhythm. The taste of roasted meat is a fading memory, replaced by the familiar blandness of the morning's porridge. As you sit there, you reflect on the entire spectrum of tastes and textures you've experienced. The overwhelming salt, the acrid smoke, the jaw-breaking toughness, the challenging funk of fermentation, the bitterness of bark. It would be easy to dismiss this entire culinary world as bad, but that would be missing the point entirely. This wasn't a diet born of bad taste or a lack of culinary imagination. It was a masterpiece of survival engineering. Every unpalatable flavor you encountered was the taste of a problem being solved. The food wasn't bad, it was incredibly, brilliantly effective. Think about the relentless saltiness of the preserved meat. That wasn't a seasoning choice, it was a chemical weapon in the war against microbes. The harsh flavor was the signature of victory over decay. The taste that guaranteed you would have protein in the dead of winter. It was the flavor of foresight. Consider the overpowering smoke that permeated everything. That wasn't an accident of a poorly designed house. It was a 24/7 food preservation system, running on the same fuel that kept you warm. The bitter campfire taste was the flavor of efficiency, the testament to a society that wasted nothing, not even its own exhaust fumes. What about the sheer, punishing toughness of the stockfish and jerky that wasn't a flaw? It was the physical manifestation of durability. That toughness meant the food was light, dry, and almost immune to the elements, capable of fueling you across vast, empty oceans. It was the flavor of portability and resilience. And the most challenging flavors of all, the soreness of the sky, and the ammonia-ted punch of fermented fish, those were the flavors of controlled decomposition, of harnessing bacteria and enzymes to do the work of preservation for you. It was a form of biological jiu-jitsu, turning the very forces of rot against themselves to create a stable, nutrient-rich food source. It was the flavor of profound, practical wisdom. Even the most desperate foods, the bitter bark bread and the earthy root mashed, tell a story not of failure, but of deep ecological knowledge. To know which tree's inner bark could be ground into flour. To know which muddy root was edible after hours of boiling, this was not common sense. This was a library of ancestral knowledge, passed down through generations, that allowed people to survive in the hunger gap when all other systems failed. The bitterness was the flavor of last resort ingenuity. This perspective shift is something historians and experimental archaeologists constantly grapple with. It's easy to judge the past by the standards of our modern, abundant present. We have refrigerators, global supply chains, and an almost infinite variety of foods at our fingertips. The Vikings had a short growing season, a long winter, and a handful of basic preservation technologies. Their entire food culture was built around one single, overriding goal, making it to the next summer. The debate in academia is not about whether the food was objectively good by our standards, it wasn't, but rather about the sophistication of the systems they developed. Some scholars focus on the nutritional aspects, analyzing the balance of proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, and arguing that, despite its lack of variety, the diet was remarkably well balanced and effective at fueling a physically demanding lifestyle. Others focus on the social dimension, arguing that the very badness of the daily food is what gave the communal feast its immense social and psychological power. You realize that to truly understand the Vikings, you have to understand what they ate. Their food tells you more about their world than 1,000 epic poems about glorious battles. It tells you about their climate, their social structure, their resourcefulness, their anxieties, and their profound, intimate connection to the land and sea. It was a diet that shaped their bodies, their health, and their society. It was the tough, salty, smoky, and sour foundation upon which the entire Viking Age was built, and the legacy of these ancient, functional flavors has not entirely disappeared. It echoes, faintly, into the modern world. Your journey through the Viking palate is over. You are back from the smoky longhouse in the windswept sea, but the ghosts of those flavors linger. You might think that such a challenging, functional, and often terrible food culture would have vanished without a trace, a forgotten relic of a harsher time, but you would be wrong. The legacy of this diet is surprisingly stubborn. It hasn't disappeared, it has evolved, transforming from a daily necessity into a powerful symbol of cultural identity. Look closely at the modern Nordic pantry, and you will see the echoes everywhere. That shockingly pungent fermented fish you tasted it lives on. In Iceland, it's called hakal, the fermented Greenland shark, a national dish eaten in tiny, brave cubes as a testament to ancestral fortitude. In Sweden, it's surströmming, the fermented Baltic herring whose skin bulges with pressure and whose smell can clear a room. These are no longer survival food. They are ritual food, challenges, and punchlines, but they are also a direct, unbroken line to the preservation techniques of the Viking Age. What about the rock-hard stockfish? It's still there. In Norway, high-quality air-dried cod, or TRR fisk, is a delicacy and a major export, prepared on the same kinds of coastal racks, using the same ancient principles of cold, dry wind, and it still serves as the base for lutefisk, the infamous gelatinous fish dish. Its preparation would lie a direct, if somewhat alarming, descendant of the Viking method for making tough, dried fish edible again. The most successful survivor of all is perhaps the most humble. The sour, tangy sky you drank has become a global health food phenomenon. Its journey from a simple farmhouse staple, created to preserve milk, to a product found in supermarkets worldwide is the ultimate story of a Viking food's resilience. Even the desperate act of foraging has been reborn. The new Nordic cuisine movement, led by world-famous restaurants, has turned the Viking safety net into haute cuisine. Chefs now forage for wild herbs, mosses, lichens, and bitter roots not to stave off starvation, but to find unique, hyper-local flavors that tell a story about the landscape. They have transformed the taste of necessity into the taste of artistry. A fascinating little detail that connects the past and present is the idea of a house flavor. The unique microbial culture of a specific farm's kveik yeast for ale, or the particular blend of bacteria in their skyr pale, gave their products a distinct terroir, long before that word was fashionable. This concept of a unique, localized flavor profile is something modern artisanal food producers strive for, a practice their ancestors did simply by not washing their equipment too thoroughly. Of course, the authenticity of this continuity is a favorite topic of debate for food historians and chefs. How much have these modern dishes changed over the centuries? Is modern hoggle truly the same as what a Viking would have eaten? Or is it a romanticized, refined version of a much rougher, more variable original? It's likely a bit of both. The tradition is real, but the context has changed everything. The terrible food of the Vikings was, in the end, anything but. It was resilient, it was intelligent, and it was deeply adapted to its world. The flavors that once meant the difference between life and death now serve a new purpose. They tell a story. They are a taste of history, a connection to the ingenuity and sheer toughness of the people who first created them. And that is a legacy more powerful than any feast. And so, our journey through time comes to a quiet close. The smoky air of the longhouse has thinned and drifted away, and the rhythmic sound of the oars on the grey sea has faded into a gentle silence. All that remains is the soft hum of the world around you now. The story, like a small boat reaching a calm shore, has come to its final rest, leaving your mind free to drift on quieter currents. Feel the weight of the blanket around you, a safe and gentle anchor in the peaceful dark of your own room. The echoes of those ancient, challenging flavors can dissolve now, replaced by the simple comfort of stillness. The faces of the Vikings, weathered by the wind and the sea, soften and blur, becoming silent shadows in the landscape of your memory. There are no more meals to endure, no more hardships to face. There is only the slow, easy rhythm of your own breathing. Let each breath be a soft wave, rising and falling, carrying you further away from the waking world and deeper into the calm waters of sleep. The narrative has ended, and the quiet space it leaves behind is yours to fill with rest, with peace, with gentle and untroubled dreams. The night is a soft, dark cloak, and you can let it envelop you now. There is nothing left to do but to let go. The end of the article. Good night.